Thank you, Leona. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's meeting of the Audit and Scrutiny Committee. I'd like to begin with the usual items of protocol before we begin today's meeting proper. Just to remind you all that it's a hybrid meeting and we do have participants joining us remotely today. Furthermore, the meeting is being recorded and a copy will be made available, as usual, for public viewing on the Council's YouTube channel following the meeting. To help with the smooth run of the meeting, if you are joining remotely, I'd be grateful if you would mute your microphone when you're not speaking, use the raise your hand function when you'd like to ask a question, and be sure to lower it again when you're finished speaking, and avoid using the chat function in Teams for debate amongst one another. For those of us in the chamber today, please remember to activate your microphone so that members online can hear you, and of course switch it off again when you're finished speaking. Myself and the officers attending will monitor proceedings with a view to ensuring all requests to speak are seen. So to go through today's attendance list, we are joined by Margaret McCrossan, Head of Accountancy. We're also joined by Phil Dawes, Head of Housing, Property and Climate Change. And thank you for joining us today, Phil. Jim Murray, Strategic Manager. That's the Departmental Support Services and Environment. Thank you for joining us also, Jim. We have Bemisola Taiwo, Housing Service Manager. Thank you. Michelle Blair, Chief Auditor. Linda Hutchison, Clerk to the Committee. Jennifer Graham, Leona Allison, and Grace Scanlon from External Audit, who is joining remotely. So it takes us to today's formal agenda. Item number 1 is apologies for absence. Clerk, I note that there's apologies from Provost Montague. If there's any others? That's the only apologies today, Clerk. Chair, sorry. Thank you very much. Item number 2, declarations of interest. So as a reminder, the Councillor's Code of Conduct requires elected members to declare any financial or non-financial interest in items in today's agenda. Are there any declarations to be made? There are no declarations to be made. Okay, swiftly moving on. Item 3 is my Chair's report. So there's just one item to update you on. At the last meeting, there was a Local Government in Scotland Overview 2023. It was a report into local government finance. So I made comments at a meeting in June where the clerk wrote to us all regarding that National External Audit Report, asking us to identify which issues by exception we wanted feedback on. There was a significant range of topics covered in that report and some summarised conclusions. There was a single matter raised, which was by myself, in context of the Council's financial position. This concerned the proposals which are currently being explored to change how bands E to H are rated for council tax and the proportion in relation to band D properties, and whether this would actually deliver a net increase in council tax collections for local benefit for us here in East Renfrewshire, or whether this would result in an overall net lower national settlement. As you've already been advised, the Director of Business Operations and Partnerships has confirmed that a draft response to the ongoing consultation on the council tax issue is to be submitted to the next full council in mid-September. As the specific issues raised are to be well addressed as part of that report, and all members will have an opportunity to discuss that to discuss the Council's proposed response to the consultation paper, I do not consider it necessary to submit a report to this committee. So I would simply ask you to note that. Councillor Bowles.
Yeah, there was some confusion as to whether this paper is going to Cabinet or whether it's going to full Council. Could we have clarification on that? Thanks.
My understanding is that it was at one point they were considering pushing it to Cabinet, but my understanding now is that it's going to full Council. I think it's the 13th of September. That's the latest information I've had from the Director of Business Operations and Partnerships.
Okay, quite satisfied. Okay. In that case then, item number 4 on today's agenda is clarification received on queries raised at previous meetings. I'd like to invite Linda to speak to this item. Thank you.
Thanks. So this is simply in the interest of transparency and is reflected in the appendix to the report. This report asks the committee to note the clarification that was received and circulated previously on queries raised regarding a consultancy cost related matter and the provision of funding for 1,140 hours of early learning and childcare following a child's third birthday. And those issues were raised at the meetings of the committee in May and June respectively. So I'm just asking you to note that you've already received that clarification.
That's super, thank you. Are there any questions on that matter, or we're happy to accept that? Okay, agreed. So, item 5 is the annual Treasury Management Report for the year 22-23, and can I invite the Head of Accountancy, Margaret McCrossan, to speak to this item. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. As committee members will know, regulations require us to report on the activities of our Treasury management operations at various points throughout the year. In the past, it's been at the end of the year that's just finished, halfway through the year, and at the start of the new year. Regulations have changed though, and we now have to provide you with quarterly updates, so you can expect more Treasury reports to be coming to Audit and Scrutiny. There'll be one at almost every meeting from now on. Today's report though is looking back on the year that's just finished. It's a very high level report showing the Council's debt position, and it's also got various graphs showing the movement in temporary borrowing and in deposits that we've placed over the last financial year. So we'll start off to say, as part of our Treasury Management Strategy that is reported to Council at the same meeting as we set our Council tax and our budget for the year, way back in March 2022, we anticipated borrowing 65 million for the year 22-23. 10 million of that was actually a figure that had been carried forward from the previous year. But as you'll be aware, due to rescheduling of capital expenditure into future years and high interest rates encountered, only 10 million of that new borrowing was actually taken on during the year. So you'll see that a lot of our indicators are certainly a lot lower down and certainly well within our limits as far as the borrowing is concerned. Secondly, a number of other indicators are in the report, and those relate to risk, prudential indicators and debt performance. So if we look at the risk ones first, the percentage of variable rate loans that the Council has should be no more than 15% of our total debt outstanding, and that's to protect us if there are rapid changes in interest rates. In the last year, the highest level of variable rate loans we had was just over 7%. So we were well within that indicator. Although we expect that this will creep up a wee bit as our normal borrowing is paid off, or reduce as further borrowing is taken on. So it'll always change a little, but we're well within the 15%. Also, when we're looking at our debt profile, we want to make sure that the maximum amount of long-term debt maturing in any one year should be no more than 15% of the Council's long-term outstanding debt at the time of that borrowing, and that's to make sure that we're not subject to large fluctuations in the movement and the costs of the debt. And again, the current profile shows that for all our years borrowing, the maturity profile is well within the agreed limits. Moving on from risk to the prudential indicators in the report, these are the numbers that confirm that our capital investment plans and Treasury management decisions are affordable, prudent and sustainable. In particular, if you're looking at page 11 of the report, indicators 3 and 4 show the Council is operating well within its limits. And the movement in indicators 2 and 5, which indicates how much internal borrowing the Council needs to take, that shows that our planned internal borrowing for the year was expected to be 25 million. But again, because we deferred a significant amount of net capital expenditure in the year, we only actually utilised 19.4 million. So again, we're well within the expected limits for that. And this is all in relation to slippage and delays and rescheduling of the capital expenditure. As far as the debt performance is concerned, our average pool rate for our local authority loans fund was slightly higher than average, and that was because we didn't take on a lot of new borrowing at the low rates which were historically in place because of the slippage in the capital programme. And also, we only had a small amount of high interest debt coming to the end of its life, maturing and being paid off. So those both impacted on that. In addition, when we're investing our surplus funds, it's our policy to have a relatively low appetite for risk. So if we're trying to place money temporarily, we don't chase the highest return on that money. We don't want to take risks with the council's capital. So we keep to relatively safe investments. Although, as you'll be aware, even with those relatively safe investments, the way interest rates are at the moment, we're certainly bringing in more interest than we had budgeted for, certainly last year and in the current year. So there is an upside to a degree to the higher interest rates as far as our investments are concerned. Our overall average borrowing rate did, however, reduce by 0.18% from last year. And again, it's within the indicators and the plans approved as part of our Treasury strategy. And finally, at the end of the report, as usual, we ask that the committee approve the list of counterparties in Appendix 8, and those are the bodies that we would be happy to invest the council's money with. They've all got high credit ratings, and we've got various limits on the periods of time that we are happy to invest with these bodies, and these are arrived at in conjunction with our Treasury Management advisors. So hopefully that's taken you through it, and if anyone's got any specific questions, I'll do my best to answer those in Barbara's absence, because she's actually luckily away on holiday at the moment.
Lucky Barbara. So does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? I have Councillor Ireland.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Margaret. I hope she's having a fabulous holiday, wherever she is. Can I ask, just wonder if this is working okay? Can I ask two questions? And apologies, I might have missed the figure on the first question I'm about to ask, but you mentioned that there was a sort of a benefit with the additional interest that was coming in. Is there a figure on that we're accruing? And also the 7.17 in variable rate loans, do you know where we sit in relation to other councils with that figure? Is that other local authorities sitting around the same figure, or are some local authorities taking that up to that higher figure that they can? I'm just curious. Thank you.
Okay. Firstly, on the increased interest, you'll see that part of the improved year-end position that we reported was due to this, and it was around £1 million of extra interest. Obviously that built up more towards the end of the year as interest rates kept rising, and as we had more and more money still sitting there to be invested. As we are avoiding taking on new borrowing, if we're investing in our capital, the plan is we take some of those cash resources and we use those to fund capital. So we expect our overall balances will start to go back down again, and you would expect that to reduce the amount of interest that we'll be able to generate. However, interest rates are still rising at the moment, so we're not yet seeing that falling back. So having set our budget for £300,000 or £400,000 of temporary interest income, we expect at the moment that it could be significantly over again, and that will be reported in our period 3 revenue monitoring, which is coming up to you very soon. On your second question, the 15% that we set ourselves, it's a figure that we set. It's not a national figure. So I don't have information on how other councils are doing against that one.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I have a question also, Margaret. In terms of page 16, the temporary deposit interest rate, that's the interest income that the council's had. So we've got the figures there up to the end of March 23, and it's yielding at just under 4%. I fully appreciate that yield is not the first priority that the council seeks to obtain with these deposits. It's security is the priority. But we know from March up to date, there have been further successive increases in the Bank of England base rate. Can I ask, has that upward trend continued in line with the base rate increasing?
Yes, in terms of the council's investments, I'm pleased to say yes, it has increased. Today we were able to secure just over 5% on our temporary deposits, and that's short term. It's very short term.
Okay, that's super. Thank you. Are there any further questions, Councillor Wallace?
Yeah, a number of things. First of all, would I be right in thinking, as far as the level of borrowing is concerned, East Renfrewshire, we were probably one of the councils with the least amount of borrowing compared with the amount of revenue, etc., that was coming in. And I know that was kind of drifting back a wee bit. So unfortunately, I don't have the information here, but I would be interested to have that information at some point in the future, just to see if our level of borrowing has increased significantly, that we should be concerned. The comments as far as a number of times the phrase well within our limits has been mentioned, and I think we need to welcome that. I know other councils in which a huge amount of borrowing going on in order to keep up with capital spend, etc. But as we can find, as time moves on, the more borrowing we've got, and here we are now, there's plenty of us here of an age that can remember the days of 15, 16, 17% interest rates and mortgage, etc. And what's happening now was bound to come back at some point. So the fact that we're working well within our limits is to be commended to our officers for maintaining that. I know our appetite for risk maybe took a dent during when we had some monies with the Icelandic bank, which fortunately we managed to get back in time. But overall, I would say it's an encouraging report, and commend the staff for producing it in the manner that they have. Thank you.
That's super. Thank you, Councillor. Margaret, are you able to field those questions in terms of where we are in relation to other authorities and borrowings?
I can't give any update at the moment because we rely on the annual Audit Scotland reviews and updates, and the external auditors are obviously only just carrying out the 22-23 audits. When those are all completed and the figures all consolidated, there will be an overview report, and the auditors will make comments nationally about the relative debt levels of Scottish councils. We have always historically, as you say, been one of the ones with the lower level of debt. However, we have flagged for a number of years that because the council's ambitious capital plans, that will creep up, as will the level of loan charges we have to pay out of our revenue budget, and that is covered both in our revenue budget setting and in our treasury management strategy every year. But as soon as we get the national picture for 22-23, then it will be reported back.
That would be very welcome. Thank you. So, on the basis of no further questions, I'd be happy to accept the recommendations in the report that we note the Treasury Management Report and recommend to full Council the attached list of counterparties. Okay, I have a nod. Okay, agreed. Okay, so that moves on to the next item on the agenda, which is the review of the external wall insulation and roofing contract. Now, this was obviously initially discussed at a previous meeting of the Audit and Scrutiny Committee, and we are joined by relevant officers and staff from within that department. So I would like to begin by inviting the clerk to initially introduce the report, and then we'll move on to others. Thank you.
Just to reiterate, really, the internal audit report that's in the papers and the associated management response is submitted to the committee for consideration, and that was following some discussion on the issues raised in that report at the committee's meeting in May. The subsequent circulation of the internal audit report is agreed at that meeting to members of the committee to enable them to review it and the associated management response in more detail. And it having been determined that there was a wish to discuss the report further at the meeting today. So as reflected in the internal audit progress report, all of the recommendations made were accepted by management for implementation. And we've got both the head of housing, the strategy manager and the housing services manager here today to answer questions from members on the report. So I'm just asking you to consider how you want to progress. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Clerk. I think I'd like to kick off initially by inviting Phil Dawes to speak as the head of service in the area affected. Then we'll open it out to elected members to put questions. I think that's the best way to proceed. So Phil would like to invite you to speak.
Okay, thank you. As Linda has said, all of the recommendations in the report have been accepted. None of them are contested, and obviously the report explains what happened. I think I would like the opportunity to explain both why what happened and also what measures we are putting in place to ensure it doesn't happen again. Just to give people the background, ordinarily we would have a team of 5 quantity surveyors managing around 25 projects a year. At the time this problem occurred, we were dealing with 35 projects instead of the normal 25. This was 2022, and there'd been a backlog of capital projects from 2020 and 2021 as a result of work not going ahead during COVID. And instead of having the usual complement of 5 staff, we had 3 staff because we had 2 vacancies for quantity surveyors which we couldn't fill. We undertook multiple recruitment exercises. So instead of having 5 staff dealing with 25 projects, i.e. 5 projects per staff member, we had about 3 staff dealing with 35 projects, which was getting on to 12 projects per staff member. In addition, it was an inexperienced team. Of those 3 staff, 1 was newly qualified, and the second, although an experienced quantity surveyor, was new to the council and new to the public sector. And obviously, whilst the business of being a quantity surveyor is the same irrespective of public or private practice, a lot of the rules surrounding it can differ. To add to that problem, at the time that the tender was issued in December 2021, we'd just gone back into a lockdown as a result of Omicron. A number of the technical staff in technical services team were required to be in the office to use their PCs as opposed to laptops, because due to the software they used, they required specialist laptops, and those specialist laptops weren't issued until the summer of 2022. Finally, we were finding at the time a lot of tenders needed to be re-evaluated more quickly. So pre-COVID, if a tender came in, sometimes a contractor would hold their prices for several months, so we would have plenty of time to assess the tender. During the inflation that has occurred in the last 12 to 18 months, a lot of contractors were only prepared to hold their prices for a couple of weeks, so there was quite a bit of pressure on a smaller team to turn things around more quickly. Finally, part of the work was due to be paid by Scottish Government funding. Scottish Government provide funding for owner-occupiers, and we required to accept the terms of their grant before the new PAS standard, PAS 2035, had been finalised. So we couldn't delay the issue of the contract until past 2035 was finalised, else we would potentially lost the Scottish Government grant. So as a consequence, we decided to go with a design and build approach of bill and quantities. But unfortunately, given an inexperienced team, a reduced team and working at pressure, that was a perfect storm. And I think the biggest mistake that the team made was they actually should have said to housing services, we don't have the capacity to take this work on, we can't do it. And I think they took on too much work, and I think they adopted the mantra of getting the work done before the mantra of appropriate management of getting the work done. And I say to my staff on a regular basis, I would rather they did 6 jobs well than did 10 jobs not so well and cut corners. And I think that was one of the big issues there. And I think, as I said, technical services should have come to me and said, we can't take this work on. As a consequence, we failed to predict the forthcoming breach of contract standing orders. Now, by October 2020, we hadn't breached contract standing orders, but had staff looked at the situation, they could have anticipated that contract standing orders would have been breached in the future. And by way of example, if one has a 12-month contract that's worth £120,000 and is even spend, one would expect to spend £10,000 a month. So if after 4 months that contract had a spend of £90,000, although at that point contract standing orders hasn't been breached because one is still below the level of £120,000, just the application of simple arithmetic would lead one to conclude that if one continues to spend at that rate, then contract standing orders will be breached. And I think part of the inexperience of that team, as I say, a newly qualified surveyor and one new to the council, unfamiliar with council procedures, they should have anticipated and thought about council's contract standing orders and submitted a report to Cabinet to advise them that expenditure was likely to exceed the amounts. Obviously, an internal audit report talks about findings that are out of place. It's not the place of an internal audit report to report on anything else. But I think what doesn't come across in the report is there's an awful lot of management of the contract that goes ahead, much of which is verbal and sometimes not followed up by written instruction. So when one comes along several months later looking for evidence, that evidence may not be there. That doesn't mean that, for example, certain activities such as meetings didn't take place, but it can be very difficult to retrospectively evidence things when advice isn't followed up by written instruction. And that is one of the things that happen when people try and cut corners and they do too many projects, and to say back to the mantra of doing 6 projects well and not trying to do 10 jobs. Just to reassure the audit committee, the technical services team do manage contracts well. Just yesterday, I was asked to approve the suspension of one contractor because we weren't happy with them. At the same time, yesterday, my staff were involved in discussions with another contractor about a building refurbishment where a contractor stated that certain work was essential. We felt it wasn't essential and didn't feel it necessary to incur that expenditure for the public purse. Staff do take a lot of pride in their work. They will frequently work additional unpaid hours in the evenings and the weekends. I do wish to touch upon one of the points that was made in the report into Patterson housing staff were either unwilling or unable to provide the likely quantities of housing to be completed. I don't think it's a question of unwilling. The housing staff and the technical services staff had a difference of opinion as to what they thought the overall cost per unit would be, and the technical services staff thought it might be slightly higher, and therefore they felt that fewer houses would be undertaken, and the housing staff felt it would be slightly, the cost per house would be slightly lower, and therefore based upon a set budget thought that more houses would be needed to be undertaken. In terms of what we are putting in place to prevent this happening again, we can split our projects into 3 types of projects. One, which are projects that are finished but haven't received financial closure. Second, are projects on site. And the third are projects which we are undertaking preparatory works but haven't yet gone to tender. I have put in place a new procedure where rather than services approach the team individually to allocate work, any new work that is not currently on site requires to be allocated by Jim Murray here, who is the manager for technical services. I've notified all heads of service from environment, HSCP, business operations and the trust of that approach to ensure that we don't reach that point again where we take on too much work. The issue of the breaching contract standing orders was addressed in a report to Cabinet on the 11th of May of this year. In terms of further new approaches we have implemented, monthly valuations will now be undertaken. They'll be completed by the staff. They will be signed off by my colleague Jim Murray and then sent to myself. Revised written procedures have been introduced to ensure that staff know what to do, how to do it in certain and particular situations. We are currently reviewing which frameworks and which procurement methods should be used, recognising that sometimes our capacity to take on all projects will be diminished. There'll be possibly an increasing likelihood that we will need to go out to other parties to undertake the work. It's appropriate that we ensure that those works are procured correctly and achieve best value for the council. So currently with the Chief Procurement Officer, we are looking at which frameworks and which procurement methods can be used. Staff are instructed now to take minutes of all meetings and to verify any instructions in writing. And in short, I've given the message to staff that they need to slow down and do fewer projects, but do them better. Furthermore, a quarterly capital board has been initiated and is being chaired by the director of the department, which will look at not just capital spend for technical services, but will include roads, city deal and major capital projects. Contract standing orders are currently being revised by the Chief Legal Officer and the Chief Procurement Officer, and staff will be trained in those procedures and will be retrained each year to ensure that any of that knowledge doesn't slip away. I'm also looking at more general training for the team. So, for example, the Housing Service have recently introduced mandatory protective learning time for the Housing Service. I'm in the process of looking at that for the Property and Technical Services staff. That programme of training will relate to procurement, frameworks, project management, new technology. There's a lot of new technology and regulations around at the moment. For example, we spoke about past 2035, as there's an increasing need to decarbonise all of our public buildings. A lot of these standards and regulations are changing year-on-year basis. That training regime hasn't yet been introduced, partly because I need to assess the number of projects that we currently have on site, because obviously when one undertakes training, one is not working directly on projects, so I need to assess the capacity. I also need to ensure that we can establish an appropriate training budget. We are also undertaking a more substantial review of technical services in terms of its structure, given our difficulties around recruitment. Our recruitment issues have been present for 2 to 3 years. I think it would be needlessly optimistic of me to assume that in the next 2 to 3 years that will get any easier. Our problems around recruitment of quantity surveyors and architects, it's not just restricted to technical services. I know that planning are struggling in relation to planners. I know that perhaps accountancy are struggling in relation to accountancy. We are struggling as a public sector to recruit staff appropriately. Just to summarise, before the paper on the breach of contract standing orders went to Cabinet on the 11th of May, I know the Chief Procurement Officer contacted a number of other local authorities to establish whether what we paid for the external wall insulation was consistent with what other councils paid. And those other councils did confirm that we received the best price for that work. The contractor that we have used is a competent contractor. They're a contractor we have worked with for many years. They're a contractor that do a lot of work with neighbouring local authorities. External wall insulation is expensive. If one follows some of these conversations taking place in the media, there's obviously a big conversation at the moment about the expense of decarbonising people's homes. So although the price that we paid is substantial, it's not felt to be excessive in terms of the market. Housing are actually looking at 3 different methods of looking at this work, and we're undertaking 3 pilots. We've got the piece of work we've done here with design and build using bill of quantities. We're also for a small number of properties, we're going to go for design and build using a normal tender. And then furthermore, for a small number of properties, we're going to separate the design and build and put that out for tender as well. At the end of that exercise, we'll have used 3 different methodologies to assess how we can install external wall insulation into our properties. So to summarise, whilst these mistakes are clearly unfortunate, we haven't received any loss of best consideration. As a result of this, a number of measures have been put in place to address them, and I'm happy to take any questions.
That's great, Phil. Thank you for that comprehensive report. I would also note some, it's welcome some of the points of clarification as well. Particularly, one of the questions I kind of had in mind was around the unable or unwilling aspect. But I'm glad that you've clarified that in your report. Before I put out to questions, I suppose the key thing there was that all the internal audit recommendations have been implemented. So I suppose I'd like to kick off with a question to Michelle Blair from Internal Audit. Are you comfortable that these recommendations have all been implemented, or is there follow-up work to come in the pipeline to gain that assurance?
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy that all the recommendations have been accepted. There's 3 that have already been implemented already, and we'll obviously do follow up in the near future to check that the others have been implemented.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Turning to elected members' questions, this is quite a lengthy internal audit report. It's quite technical in nature. I don't think that this is going to work if we are jumping around the report. I think we need to take us in a kind of chronological sequence going through the report in terms of the questions that we put. Although if there is something which is said which prompts a supplementary question or a need to go back, then we will of course accommodate that. So I would like to kick off with a question, which is, Phil, you said that there was a time pressure to get this in for December 21 because of national grant funding from mixed tenure properties. If the decision was made to defer the contract, what would the potential loss have been to the council of that grant funding, and to what extent does that kind of almost offset the overspend on the contract?
The grant is offered by the Scottish Government for owner-occupiers that choose to participate in the programme. Now, at the time, we obviously don't know at the onset how many owner-occupiers would choose to participate in the programme. I think the best course of events in hindsight would have been that we told the Scottish Government that we couldn't comply, and that we tried to negotiate with the Scottish Government an extension of the timeline or a negotiation of the terms and conditions. I think I can understand why the decision was taken to accept the timeline and to try and proceed and work around that timeline. But I think the more prudent thing would have been to reject the timeline and negotiate it with the Scottish Government.
Okay, understood. Any questions from the floor at this stage? Councillor Wallace.
Just in the absence of anybody else coming forward. As you know, Chair, I put in a list of questions. I've actually done it in chronological order in order that we can just, as you're suggesting there, rather than picking in from different parts of the report. I think what we need to get clear, first of all, is that the purpose of this, and the purpose, I've been pushing for this to be brought forward, because I feel that as an audit committee, to allow this just to go through unquestioned in any way we wouldn't be doing our job. But the other thing I want to make clear is that this is not a witch hunt. It's to find out what went wrong and what's been done to sort it out. And you've obviously come forward with a number of suggestions, and I can understand that a lot, indeed, it would appear that all the recommendations that have been made by internal audit have been accepted and are being worked on just now. So it's being sorted. The concern I think the audit committee should have is how it happened in the first place, because there seems to be a number of very fundamental workings that should have been pretty straightforward, but just didn't seem to come into fruition at the time. Now, looking at this 2-3 years after COVID, we've maybe forgotten about a lot of the problems that we had with COVID and the working arrangements. And I appreciate what you say in terms of laptops and access to the office, etc. is concerned. However, if I could just, and I presume you were forwarded all the communication that I sent to the clerk. So the first one we had there was how we felt it was acceptable to issue a tender document whose content is known to be both unrealistic and where key works are omitted. If we could just do this one at a time, if we could. Okay.
Yes, please. Questions one at a time, because there may well be other elected members who had that same question in mind, and we'll really need to hear the answer once. Thank you.
Well, I suppose the key is known to be unrealistic. And I think the point is, because it was inexperienced staff, I don't think it's the case that it was known to be unrealistic. I think subsequently, upon analysis, some of the quantities were found to be unrealistic, but I don't think it's the case that at the time that the bill of quantities was issued, they were known to be unrealistic. If they were known to be unrealistic, it wouldn't have been issued. The bill of quantities, I think, has, is it something like 300? Something like 300 lines against it. You'll see in the audit report on page 2, 5.2, it splits the bill down into 9 component parts. Each of those component parts has sub-component parts. So we are talking about multiple quantities, or rather multiple tasks, and each of those tasks have a quantity. Some of those quantities were incorrect, but I don't think I'm not sure it would be accurate to say they were known to be incorrect when it was issued, because if they were known to be incorrect, it wouldn't have been issued. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
And as I say, I think in part it's inexperienced staff and perhaps maybe taking 20 minutes on a task that should have had 60 minutes taken on it as a result of workload meant that some of these things were missed.
Right, inexperienced staff. If anyone's taken on people with inexperience, who are inexperienced and given a project such as this, would it be fair to say that management should have been looking much more closely at the tender documents that were going out and how they were being managed?
Yes, I think that is fair. I think what I would say at the time is, because we had a shortage of quantity surveyors, the senior manager in technical services was possibly doing a large part of quantity surveying work to deal with that deficiency and perhaps spending less time on the managerial side of things. I then move on to the person above the technical services manager, which is Jim Murray, my colleague to my right at the time. He has 4 direct reports. Of those 4 direct reports, 1 had recently been appointed and 1 had recently left. So the capacity within the team was much diminished. And as I've said, the most significant failing was the team should have said, we don't have the capacity to take this work on. I think the team was trying to help other services in taking it on. I think the wrong judgment call was made and they should have declined to take the work on.
Can I ask who's in charge of the team? Who looks after that team?
Okay. After this question, we need to move on to. Obviously, we will come back.
Are we meant to address this, or are we just going to do the motions?
Yeah.
The alternative is we can actually take this out in here and have a discussion out with, maybe in time, because I'm appreciate that.
Oh, I fully appreciate what you're saying. You know, there's obviously other elected members. We will obviously come back.
I'm not stopping other elected members saying anything. Chair, I'm just asking you questions which I asked to do. You know what the list is, and we're going to do it when as you asked for.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm just keen that obviously we stagger it around so that, you know, everyone has a fair opportunity at it. But
Okay.
yes. But yeah, so Councillor Walsh, your question, and then we'll kind of open it up and bring it back.
I think your question was, I didn't know whether you were looking for the name or the name of the post of the person in charge of the team.
Right. It's a team that came in, and what you were saying earlier on was that senior management should have been advised earlier by that particular team, and just trying to find out why why these messages did not come up the way. And I can only assume that the person who is looking after that team is not taking responsibility for it. These are only assumptions I'm making. I'm happy.
I think it would be unfair to say they weren't taking responsibility for it. I think there was unrealistic optimism bias in terms of their capacity to undertake the work.
So at this stage, Councillor Allen, do you have any questions you'd like to put? Councillor McDonald, I don't know if you indicated with your hand that you wish to speak also. Okay, we'll take Councillor Allen, then Councillor McDonald.
Thank you very much. Apologies, Chair. I think my notes might be slightly out of sync, so if I jump forward, please let me know. I just wanted to keep it to maybe a general question. Then, a very first question I actually had was what steps have been taken to improve future tenders, and I was really pleased to hear the steps that you've put in place. There was quite a lot put in there, especially I particularly liked the written instructions. I think that goes without saying. So I was really pleased that you've put all that in place, and also pleased that the internal auditor was saying that all recommendations have been agreed. So that was another thing. I do have several questions. I know that you will have seen some of these, but I'll ask a very general one then. It was just, I know there was a figure of 126 units that was desired. Was that figure in the contract? How many units will be completed? I think it's 78, but is that still correct? And is there still a desire to do 126? So is there then an extra pot of money that needs to be sought to take us up to the 126? So I'll kick off with that question.
Excuse me, I'll bring in my colleague Jim Murray to answer the first part, my colleague Bemi to answer the second part in terms of future houses.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just say the 126 properties were included in the tender? These were an aspirational list of properties. At that time, obviously, we wouldn't have known the actual properties we would have carried out because the works were unknown and it was a design and build contract. So obviously the contractor would have to do all the designs for each of the buildings as we went through the contract.
Thank you, Chair. You'd ask how many were completed. So we have 81 completed under the contract, and the rest are being taken forward into future program, which we'll carry out between this financial year and next year.
Chairman.
Councillor Edwin.
I wanted to speak to later, but I noticed that the gentleman beside Mr. Dawes mentioned 126 properties. I thought it was 84 properties. Where does that number of 126 now come from?
Thank you, Chair. The 126 was an aspirational list from housing at the outset of the tender. So when we were going to do the works, housing identify a list of properties that could potentially get EWI or the insulated bid on it. And from the contractor's designs, we would then decide as we go through the contract how many would eventually be done. The target was 126, and that was included in the tender.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. It's Councillor MacDonald next, and then obviously we'll take it in sequence. Councillor MacDonald.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks to Mr Dawes for the comprehensive explanation as to what went wrong. I feel for him personally, because ultimately it's not a nice thing to happen on your watch, and ultimately I'm sure it's caused a great degree of disappointment for himself. I guess the question I've got going forward is, presumably these teams, it's quite crucial that these teams work quite closely with one another and almost self-check one another, and I wonder whether, and I presume hybrid working practices were in place for most of the staff responsible for these errors. And I was just wondering whether he has an opinion on whether hybrid working practices are realistic or perhaps even detrimental to these kind of teams working closely so that they can oversee one another. I don't know if he's got any opinion on that, and just wanted to see if he had any comment as to when he found out about these breaches and to the length of the financial outlay or overspend that it was, as to when he found out, how long after he found out, and what his initial emotional response to was on that.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Councillor MacDonald. Phil, over to you.
Okay, in terms of whether hybrid working was a factor, I think the main factor was the shortage of staff rather than the location in which the staff were working. As I've said, this is a team of 5 that would normally do 25 projects became a team of 3 doing 35 projects. I think even under those circumstances, even if they were in the office 9 to 5 working together, I'm not sure that that would have addressed the issue. So I don't really think that hybrid working was a factor. My response when I found out, the 2 questions, 3 questions, but the first 2 questions I always ask myself is, has this error occurred as a result of any kind of malfeasance from any of the staff involved? Is there any element of somebody has deliberately done something wrong, perhaps for a personal gain? And I think I was able to fairly quickly establish that that wasn't the case. My second question is always, has the public purse suffered detriment as a result of this mishap, in terms of, have we spent more than what we could or should have spent as a result of the management of this contract? And that's why I would refer the committee again to my comments when the Chief Procurement Officer tried to establish whether best value had been achieved, and I think concluded that it had, by looking at what other local authorities had paid. In terms of my emotional response, I was obviously annoyed that the problem had occurred. I needed to temper that to a degree with the fact that we had a staff team, as I say, that was inexperienced and working very hard. So I don't think the team deliberately made that mistake. It also made me reflect upon the cost of the journey that the council is going on in relation to achieving net zero, because the costs for external wall insulation are not cheap. And I was also reflecting on just how expensive that can be. That's a market price. We didn't pay too much, but I also reflected on the costs to the council in the future of achieving that net zero approach. Does that answer your questions, Councillor MacDonald?
I think Councillor MacDonald's frozen.
Yeah.
Councillor MacDonald, we lost you there. Just to confirm that you're quite satisfied your question's been answered?
I am. I just had one other question, and that was in connection with the inability to hire staff, or the inavailability of staff out there in the marketplace. And I just wanted to find out, in terms of hiring more experienced staff, is that an issue in terms that they're not available in themselves, or the fact that perhaps the council is maybe not offering a remuneration package that's attractive enough to get more experienced staff? It seems that one of your main problems that you have staff, but they're all relatively inexperienced, and that may have lent itself, as you say, to the mistakes being made.
There has been a decrease in the availability of construction professionals across the board, and both the public sector and the private sector are experiencing that, whether that is structural engineers, electrical engineers, architects, quantity surveyors. So there is a shortage in the industry. Obviously, the private sector has the capacity or ability to respond to that by offering more money. We are restricted in the public sector in terms of we have a job evaluation scheme that will say, for example, for a quantity surveyor undertakes certain tasks. Those tasks are awarded points. I think there are something like 11 to 12 categories under the council's job evaluation scheme. Each category is excuse me, awarded a number of points. Depending upon the points you get, that determines the grade. Now, we could say, well, look, we're struggling with quantity surveyors, so we need to change their grade from a grade 11 to a grade 14. One of the problems with that is you change the grade of a quantity surveyor, and then a roads engineer or an architect or an accountant says, well, hang on a minute, I need my grade changed too, and the impact on the council's wage bill would be substantial. So we have reported at our year-end meetings for the last couple of years the difficulties with our recruitment. As I say, it's not confined to technical services, so it is in part what we pay is part of the problem, but I do recognise there isn't an easy solution that the council can implement there.
That's great, thank you. I would like to come in with a question myself at this stage. It's been said a couple of times now about the team being inexperienced in some ways, and the fact that the rules on installation changed, hence the fact that the December 21 deadline was a factor. And we know from conversations we've had in this committee previously, actually, about Get to Net Zero, that this will be a continuously moving target. I think it really accentuates the need for training and ongoing training. So I wanted to turn to that section of the internal audit report, and it was noted that there was some relevant staff did not attend the appropriate training that was offered on 2 separate occasions from since July 2021, and also that some PAT staff that's property and technical services staff, they said that they only really felt they had introductory training on the new engineering contracts, and it wasn't detailed enough and is now out of date. So I suppose I'd quite like your views, Phil, and your colleagues also, on whether the training is sufficient and if some measures have to be taken to, scrutinise that staff are attending training, that training is compulsory, and that the training offered is sufficient for the job roles people hold.
Okay, well, in relation to the NEC training, this wasn't an NEC contract, so consequently, staff attendance or non-attendance of the NEC contract couldn't have been valid because it wasn't an NEC contract. In terms of training, there are 2 aspects that one needs to take into account, I think, when looking at training. One is what is the available training budget, and secondly, time spent training, one isn't spent doing the work. And obviously, one hopes with training, you get that back over the piece because you become more productive, and therefore time lost in training is gained back by becoming more productive. One of the reasons that I said that it was one of the measures that I'm looking at but haven't yet introduced is I am looking at a regime of mandatory training. I am looking at a regime of protected learning time. For example, where perhaps the office would close on a Wednesday afternoon and we undertake collective training. So it removes the onus upon just an individual to undertake training, but training can be undertaken collectively as a team. I am looking at, as I said, that training would relate to procurement, frameworks, project management, new regulations, new technology, and I'm looking to put that in place in the immediate future. But I think training is essential, and even if one is experienced, if one is an experienced architect and maybe qualified in, say, 1990, regulations, designs, use of available software packages have changed completely in the next 30 years. So continuous professional development is essential.
As a previous auditor and accountant myself, I fully agree with you on the importance for CPD, continuous professional development, because things do change for when people, are first qualified. I'd like to ask Michelle, therefore, would it be appropriate if, in any follow-up audit work which is conducted, that that implementation in terms of protected training time being delivered and compulsory training being taken up, is that something which you would be minded to check up on follow-up audit work?
I can certainly bear it in mind, given it's been raised today. But we tend to just follow up the responses we've been given. But I can look at that.
Okay, I think that'd be very helpful. Thank you. So coming back to general members' questions, I think most members have spoken. People have wanted the opportunity. Are there any further questions members would like to put? So to take Councillor Edwin Wallace in Ireland. Thank you.
I've listened to the comments today, and first of all, let me say I'm here because I represent the council taxpayers in my ward who are paying for this, and there's hundreds of thousands of pounds that have gone wrong in this, and they are entitled to an explanation and perhaps an apology for this happening. I don't know if an apology is appropriate, but let me say, in my previous incarnation in the health service, because there were problems with COVID, because there were issues, you didn't put a surgeon on duty who hadn't been trained properly. And the excuses I've heard today, and I hate to say the word excuses, frankly, for me are unacceptable. To have a situation where hundreds of thousands of pounds are lost and people have not been mandatorily trained is wrong. I mean, how can you have a situation in this situation where people are doing a professional job and training is optional? Some of them haven't done the training. Surely there should be accountability in this. I don't hear much accountability. I have not heard an apology. I don't even know if an apology is due. Is in the public sector, is this something that is just something that we shrug our shoulders and say, well, it was a bit difficult, there was too much work about? I mean, in the health service, if you couldn't do the job, you didn't do the job. You just didn't get yourself in a position where somebody's health was in danger, there was a failure. There should have been a stop before this happened to stop it happening, and it wasn't there. And we've got this report, I've read it several times, and I'm shocked by it. And I've not heard anything today to hear, well, we'll try. I've not heard any definitive plans. And I feel, on behalf of my residents, there should be much more definitive things. I was using the word things, but something more definitive should be done about this. We as a council should not be having people who are not undergoing continuous professional education and properly certificated and educated to do the job, doing the job in the first place. And there has to be accountability. Surely somebody is responsible. I don't hear that, and I'm worried about this.
I'll just supplement to Councillor Edwin's contribution that the fact we're having this conversation is the accountability, and that we are representing taxpayers' interests in having this conversation. And of course, there has been an action plan which the department has said that they will implement, and it will be scrutinised that has been implemented and been effective. I would like to, I don't know if there's any specific aspects you'd like to address there, Phil, and what has been said, and then obviously we'll move through the sequence of questions.
I'm not sure it would be fair or accurate to characterise my response as shrugging my shoulders. I think what I've tried to do is explain the circumstances that were present at the time that the problems occurred. Councillor MacDonald asked me the question how I felt when I heard about it, and I think, as I articulated, I was disappointed. I wasn't pleased by the situation. You noted that hundreds of thousands of pounds, I think, had been lost. I think just to confirm that the price we eventually paid for this work was the market price. I don't think there is a suggestion that we have overpaid. There isn't a suggestion that the public purse has been disadvantaged as a result of this. We have compared the prices that we paid with prices that other local authorities paid. We are aware of the prices that we are currently getting from one of the other pilot projects that I referenced. And I think the prices we paid for the contract for which this report is the subject of demonstrates that we received best value. So I am not going to excuse, and I don't excuse, and I am apologetic for the management of the contract, but I don't think it's fair to say that I don't think it's accurate to say that hundreds of thousands of pounds of public money were lost, and I don't think it's fair to say that my response is a shrugging of my shoulders.
Okay. Very briefly.
Mr. Dawes, thank you for that. Well, let me say this. Had the amount of the work been known at the beginning, the extent of the work being done been known, and therefore the cost of the project, which was really unknown, as your colleague said earlier, it could well, while the correct price may have been paid for it, it may have been decided at the time that there was no budget for that kind of work, and the work may have been deferred to to a later date when there were more funds available, in which case there would not have been the spending of this money in the first place, which could have been deferred. That is the point I'm trying to get over. I don't know if I'm communicating that properly to you just now, but the fact of the matter is we have this situation and it needs to be dealt with. And I mean, did I use the word shrugging your shoulders? Maybe if I did, I didn't mean to use that. Perhaps I should have said, I feel there was a lack of concern about the issue coming over to me. And this is a very serious matter. And I would have thought if you knew the exact number of properties being dealt with and it was going to cost more, you would have done it and deferred it. That's the point.
What's the supplementary question? So is it with regards to the timing of?
Yes, if you had known at the beginning, would the matter not have just been gone into? It would have been perhaps deferred to another financial year.
We have a requirement to achieve an EPC B rating for our 3,000 council homes by 2032. It's the Scottish Government stipulation. Now, the methodology that we will use for those properties will depend upon the construction type and the type of property, etc. But so if we think between now and 2032, we have 9 years, the more properties that we defer, that simply increases the number of properties we need to do per year. So in one sense, were we to have deferred that expenditure, it would have just been a deferral of expenditure. It wouldn't have been of not incurring the expenditure. With the decarbonisation or net zero agenda, that there is a substantial element for all housing providers and for all both public and private sector building owners looking at what is the best technology to decarbonise. It's an uncertain terrain at the moment. It's an uncertain terrain technologically. It's a challenging terrain financially, but it's one that we can't decline to engage in because we have a legal duty to meet certain standards by 2032, and we have so many properties that we need to do. We need to chunk that down into a certain amount each year.
That's great. No, Councillor Redland. Councillor Wallace and Councillor Ireland have been waiting for quite some time. If you're happy to give way, then fine.
Hear what you say, Mr. Dawes, but there's a further 9 years to spread the expense out, and the council did not know exactly how many properties were involved. So I mean, given that there's another 9 years and there's been a difference of however many houses, if you spread it out over 9 years, it's not going to create such an onerous cost as doing it all in the one financial year. That's the point I'm trying to make, and I hope do you understand what I'm saying in layman's terms, because I'm not a surveyor.
I think the observation I would add to that as well is obviously there has been quite substantial price inflation and the cost of the materials. So if we had waited, as Councillor Edlund had suggested, would that have had a adverse impact in terms of the costs which would have been incurred due to price inflation?
Costs could have increased had we waited. I think also it's the case that as we approach that 2032 deadline, more and more housing providers will be looking to get that work done. And unless there is a corresponding increase in the supply of contractors, an increase in the demand for the contractors could see prices increasing even further. So I accept your point, Councillor Edlin, in that had we have waited, it could have been cheaper, but equally, had we have waited, it could have been more expensive. And logistically, the fewer number of years that we have left, the more properties therefore we need to do each year, the more difficult the management of that contract becomes. So I don't disagree that with your point that there is a potential that had we waited, it could have been cheaper. There's equally the potential that had we waited, it could have been more expensive and more logistically difficult to implement. I can't emphasise enough how difficult, both financially and technologically, the challenge is to decarbonise buildings.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Councillor Walsh, do you have a question to put down? Because
yeah, I see exactly where Councillor Edlund's coming from, and I think what Councillor Edlund's getting at, and the answer is not being given, I don't think, an answer, which is, had we known what the cost was going to be, would it have been a case that, sorry, we're going to have to defer, we do not have the capital, or alternatively, is it a case that it doesn't matter what the price is? I mean, with these targets that you're having to meet, are we just going to go ahead regardless of what the cost is? And so I think what Councillor Edlund's getting at here is, it's not a question of did we lose money? No, we haven't lost money, is what you're saying. We've still got best value. We've paid the correct amount for the job being done. The question is, had we known what the price was going to be in the first place, would we have had to defer it because perhaps capital was not there, we did not have the budget to deal with it? And I don't believe that question has been answered. Thank you.
We did have the budget available. We did fewer number of properties, but we did have the budget. We didn't need to change our capital programme as a result. We were aware of the cost. We were aware of the cost that other local authorities were paying. We are, as I said, we are looking at 3 different methodologies to procure this work. And our intention is to say, well, we will look at this methodology, we will look at this methodology, we will look at this methodology. Once we have all of that information, we can draw a conclusion. But without undertaking this work, we don't have the data available to draw that conclusion. So it would be premature for us to conclude at this stage it is affordable or it isn't affordable. We need to undertake some of the work to gather some of that baseline data.
yeah, that's great. Thank you. I'd like to come on to Councillor Annette Ireland now. Thank you for waiting.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's expanding slightly on your question about training. I was, again, pleased to hear that that's been put in place, but there were a couple of things that stood out in the report, and I wondered if this was the consequence of lack of training or whether these are going to be addressed going forward. The first one was in 5.1, section 5.1, page 2, 5th paragraph. There was senior management and CMT not being informed of potential and actual overspends until the end of October 2022. But then it continues, when concerns were apparent within the Environment Department earlier than that. So I suppose, why were these earlier warning signs? But why were these ignored? Was that down to lack of training? And the other point that I wanted to bring up was that when Internal Audit was contacting Environment, there was a point here that said that Internal Audit contacted, but they were to ask how many properties were expected to be completed. But there was an unwillingness or an inability to indicate how many properties expected to be completed. I'm happy hearing that Internal Audit are happy as where things stand at the moment. But I just wondered if that would be covered under training as well. And my final, just summing up on anything I'm wanting to ask, is there any additional cost involved in this contract from the figures that we had here in the report?
In terms of the why wasn't it flagged up sooner? I think I made the point in my introduction where I gave the example. If a contract is £120,000 over 12 months, and one thinks it's going to be spent equally, so £10,000 a month, but if after 4 months one has spent £90,000, at that point, contract standing orders haven't been breached. But if one applies a simple arithmetic calculation, one could say, but if we continue at this rate of expenditure, we will breach contract standing orders. And I think that was a lack of experience from the staff in terms of their knowledge of contract standing orders to apply the cost of the job against the council's contract standing orders. So I don't think in that regard it was an unwillingness to comply. I think it was a failure to appreciate the implications on contract standing orders, and that's where additional training is required.
And it's just, if it ever happens again, I suppose it did worry me that if internal audit get in touch, that there is a willingness to work with internal audit and pass all information on, if that could be addressed through training as well.
I wouldn't necessarily say there was an unwillingness. I think it was just nobody was willing to commit to saying how many properties, more than unwilling to work. I've got a good working relationship with environment.
That's all I wanted to hear. That's fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. I know Councillor MacDonald has indicated he'd like to ask a question.
Yes, thanks, Chair. I'm acutely aware that, Audit and Scrutiny Committee and Cabinet are probably the two committees really that are most focused on by members of the public and the press, obviously. And I wouldn't be surprised if the press pick up on what we're talking about right now, and probably will read about it in due course, and it will therefore be picked up on by the public. And the public rightly will, well, not necessarily rightly, but expectedly, some of the public will probably be considerate of the fact that there might have been a degree of professional incompetence in terms of what's happened. Now, I'm not suggesting that has taken place, and I wouldn't even be as bold as suggest that. But what I would say is, and I think it's important that we go on record here and give Mr. Dawes the opportunity to go on record. At any time throughout this process, Mr. Dawes, did you ever identify anything that would be considered to be professional incompetence in regards to some of these decisions being made, rather than just simple errors, human errors, lack of experience? I think it's important that the public know whether there was a degree of professional incompetence, and if there was, what would be the course of action once that had been identified? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Councillor MacDonald. So I think the key emphasis for us as a committee is looking at the systems and the processes rather than necessarily individuals who have been involved in this. However, in terms of an organisational view, Phil, I'd appreciate if you had any input into that.
Okay. It is the case that I have arranged for all of the staff to be formally spoken with, to go through the contents of the audit report, to discuss certain aspects with them. In terms of professional incompetence, I know from having undertaken disciplinary investigations and disciplinary hearings as a officer for a number of years, one needs to look at not just what happened, but the circumstances in which it happened. I think given what one could perhaps determine excessive workloads that some of the staff experienced, when things are missed, and I don't think there's any doubt that things were missed, whether that can be attributed to incompetence rather than work-related pressures, I think it's difficult to say, and I'm not sure that an audit committee is an appropriate place for me to comment on individual staff.
Yeah, but thank you for that. I mean, I think it's quite important to note that that's a matter for human resources, and this is not human resources department. That's my view on it. Councillor Buchanan.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It was just to come back on that, and I think Mr. Dawes and yourself just touched on a point there. What we have is a report where clearly there have been some aspects in the initial findings which have been deemed to, where information wasn't as it should have been. Let's say that could have been done better, and we're aware of those aspects and they have been highlighted. And I think the report today highlights not just, yes, there were issues, there were circumstances that were ongoing, that some of them were external, some of them internal, in terms of the pressures on the team that have been factored in. But I think the notable aspect on it is, one, the work was still required and needed to be done, and indeed continues, because that isn't going to change, as Mr. Dawes has highlighted. The other aspect has been, I think, the good work that has been carried out by our audit group and by Michelle in ensuring that practices and recommendations have been made, which fixes and puts in place a set of circumstances which should enable, one, greater clarity going forward, and two, that some of the aspects which are being touched on aren't missed. And I think that's the important aspect going forward. We know that there hasn't been any significant loss, as has already been highlighted in the paper, and indeed in the costs of the work that has already been undertaken. We know that work will be undertaken in the future, and we hope that all of the measures and recommendations that have been highlighted have been put in place and ensure that the correct tender process and the correct, therefore, valuation put on that work gets carried out, and indeed that the work itself is done as is required, not just by getting to net zero, but for the benefit of our tenants and residents as well, because the work is critical in moving forward. And I think they are some of the key aspects which, as an audit committee, we have had the report, we have looked at it, we have questioned it, and the recommendations are there and have already been implemented in many aspects. And we know what aspects are continue to be taken forward in terms of training, etc. And that should be a protective factor for our staff to ensure that they are working with the best training, with the best conditions that are suitable for the jobs that they're doing, and that gets taken forward. Thank you.
No, that's great. Thank you, Councillor Buchanan. I think that seems a fairly fair summary of the discussion so far. There has been a degree of repetition in terms of some of the points that we're going over, so I'd like to ask all members, are there any new points which anyone would like to bring to the discussion or ask a question? Councillor Wallace.
Yeah, can I ask who in the team is responsible for the financial monitoring of contracts? And if that person is here, as we can find out why. We appreciate their short staff, etc., but when it comes to the financial monitoring, I'd be keen to know whether problems in staffing on the financial monitoring side of things that allowed this to go on for such a period of time. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. I just wanted to say that the way the surveying team works is the surveying team do applications and costing reports. This was the part that was missed in this whole project, was the monthly costing reports. There would be no information that would have indicated any problems in that contract for the team leader or myself regarding that contract, because there wasn't in place the regular amount of financial applications, projections at that time. The team that were involved in this project in particular were also involved in multiple other projects getting done at the same times. The criticism we have in our own self and our own team is they probably prioritised getting a lot of work done as opposed to doing some of the day-to-day management. And again, because the team is junior team members we have got far more responsibility. And when we go to do our financial monitoring, our financial monitoring is based on the known information. This information wasn't known at the time. They would have been providing financial information of other projects and other contracts that are not being discussed just now. So again, this is probably the project that probably slipped for those controls while the controls were put in place for the rest of those projects that we were working on at the time. For instance, the summer programme for education. This is the same small team of 3 people that carry out all the surveying duties of all the projects carried out at the same time. So again, you are quite correct. The financial monitoring should have been put in place, but I think the resources were working on different projects, and those ones aren't here today. The one that did slip, we're discussing today. So again, I think that's the reason why.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Councillor Wallace.
Just to come back on that, the one that we know about that slipped, we're talking about today. We don't know about others that may be under that 100,000 that has to be reported, etc. Just want to come back. I mean, we've been referring quite often to junior staff here and the pressure, which I can fully understand. And invariably, as a junior member of staff, you're wanting to be seen to be doing your job as efficiently as possible, and you don't want to say, no, I can't do this anymore. So there is an understandable culture there that with junior staff who want to prove themselves and do not want to say no. What I have to come back to is it's a financial, I see it as being a distinct failure in management of that team that we're talking about here. And I understand now, and with internal audit, that these are factors that are being dealt with just now. But to my mind, this lays firmly at the door of management. And it's an area which, yes, it's been dealt with, but should never have happened in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wallace, for those salient observations. And if I could just tag on to that, a further question. Is there any element of a secondary person reviewing these valuations, or sporadic spot checks of a cross sample, for that kind of secondary review that these are correct?
One of our audit recommendations is about tendering, getting people to check them. What we have committed to, and we've already said to Michelle, we will endeavour to do as much of that as possible. The problem is the volumes we were undertaking at that time. So as my head of service, Phil, has already said, we will slow down the amount of projects we undertake and make sure those checks and balances for the council are put in place in the future.
Okay, that's great, thank you. Any further questions? Yes?
Just one last thing. I mean, we don't want this to be a situation in which people are fearful of doing their job and feel, well, I'm not going to do that just in case something's happened. I think it was important that this was brought up and people have said what they felt, and the opportunity has been given to the department to respond to these, which they have responded in the manner that they have. I'm happy that internal audit are keeping a monitoring on this. But as I say, we don't want the situation in which, as a result of this, people are fearful of doing their job. We do appreciate the work that they do, and just want to make sure that message goes over, particularly to the junior staff. Thank you.
That's great. Well, in the last couple of open rounds of opportunities to ask questions, it's already been Councillor Wallace has indicated interest, and I think that seems like quite a good point to wrap that up. It's not obviously the end of the matter. There will be the additional check-in from Michelle Blair in internal audit on terms of the implementation of the recommendations. Councillor Redden, is that a final point?
Yes, I just feel that, bearing in mind the demands of continual professional developments in many professions, it does seem, from what you've said today, that there is no such requirements in surveying and that kind of profession. And I think the council would be wise, and this committee perhaps should be making recommendations that throughout the council's professional services in the wider term, that the appropriate continued professional education should be mandatory on all staff, and that we keep up with the industry and profession standards for each individual profession within the council's staff. Because we've heard here that professional staff, have not had education on certain aspects of their job up to the latest standards. And that worries me a lot, and I would like to see it rectified throughout the council.
Thank you for those concluding remarks. I mean, there is obviously an action plan which has been suggested from internal audit to the department, which has been implemented, and there will be follow-up work on that to ensure that the implementation has been satisfactory, so that from this time point forward, we do not have a recurrence of this kind of event. And ultimately, that is what we all want to see as a product of today's discussion. So I'd like to conclude by thanking three members from the Environment for coming along to this afternoon's meeting, and thank you for such conclusive answers to the questions. And with that, I'd like to move us on to the next item on the agenda. Yes, and I'd like to invite Margaret McCrossan to speak to the final point in this item. Thank you.
In view of what we've just heard, in particular the workloads and that staff have been basically trying to deliver too much, I want to relate this back to the Treasury Management item, which we heard of earlier. You'll hear there that there was an element of capital slippage, and taken together with the contract that we've just heard about, I think it demonstrates that quite often, as the council tries to be very ambitious on their capital plans, sometimes we're maybe going beyond what is realistic to deliver. There is a group of officers, corporate asset management group, that Phil and I both attend, and we oversee what the capital plans are, both for the current year and for future years. And I think this is an area that, as we reassess what it's realistic to deliver in terms of capital, we'll have to come back and perhaps adjust the future year's capital plans so that we're both taking cognizance of the staffing resource that's available to us and putting in place realistic forecasts of what capital expenditure can be delivered and is required to be funded for future years. So I would expect that this will flow through into Treasury Management as well.
Okay, thank you for that. So with the end of that discussion, we're now on to the final item of this afternoon's agenda, which is a report on the Internal Audit Plan Progress Report 23-24 for Q1. So Michelle, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Internal Audit Plan Progress Report for Q1. There was one audit relating to Plan 23-24 work issued in the quarter, and there was 7 relating to 22-23 work, which have now been issued since the last progress report. There's still one audit still to be issued, and that's New Council House builds, which I'll summarise in the next progress report, but it might also be mentioned in the annual report, which will come to the September meeting. The audit work for this particular audit, New Council House builds, was completed several weeks ago, but the department want more time to clarify the factual accuracy of the report before we issue it. It's Mr. Dawes, and he's given me assurances that he'll turn around the response quite quickly. There was one item covered by contingency, and this was relation to direct debits being taken early from council tax, and this has already been dealt with in previous audit committees, so I won't mention that anymore. In terms of the reports that we've issued and received responses since the last progress report, council tax, there's not much to add because I've circulated the report in full and the responses to members, and I chose to do that because all the recommendations were high or medium, and rather than replicating it in summary, I thought it would be better if you had the full report. In terms of direct payments in HSCP, the budget is approximately 5 million per annum. There was 2 high-risk recommendations, and these were both linked to financial reviews not being up to date. So again, we'll do follow-up on that in the next few months. Creditors, I'm happy to say that all recommendations from previous reports have been fully implemented, which is quite rare. There's still an ongoing issue with levers, which crops up in quite a few audits. Sorry, my laptop's just completely gone. So there's a common theme coming through creditors, debtors, and various other audits that, as a council, we're not particularly good at managing the levers process, and that's something that I've been speaking to HR about, and we'll be looking at more fully in an audit that we're currently doing at the moment on payroll. And I'll report back to Audit Committee on that probably in the next progress report. subject to any questions, I would just ask you to approve the progress report.
Thank you very much. I'd like to kick off with a question which is on the council tax aspect. That's bullet point number 2. So thank you for circulating a copy of the full audit report. Obviously, you recognise that quite a number of the omissions there were medium and high risk in nature. As an elected member, I'm sure the other elected members here and online, we've had correspondence from the people we represent regarding, council tax and delays in terms of applying for reliefs and discounts and these kinds of things that they come to us to take up and champion. And I do wonder if some of that and the delays which people experience before they come to their local councillor is perhaps related to some of the conclusions you've reached in this report. And part of that is obviously the change to this new system. And one would expect benefits to arise from moving to a new system, efficiencies to be found, but that appears to be the opposite of what the concluded outcome of this report is. So I was just wondering if something went awry with how this software has been implemented or delivered, or does it come back to the kind of lack of training that we've been discussing in the previous item?
I don't really know the response to that, because I think it was a combination of factors. The new system was being put in at a time when we were in lockdown, and there was a lot of other things going on. So I don't know whether it'd be better addressed to the department itself.
I think that would be quite a good idea, because it is something which obviously we monitor in the local government benchmarking framework, and it is something which all elected members will have, in their mailbag from elected members, as concerns around the council tax. It's the one thing the council does which impacts on every resident, if you see what I mean. So yeah, that would be welcome. Are there any other questions from members? No. Okay, on that basis, elected members happy to accept the recommendations. Are there any further reports members like to see the detailed audit reports of? No. Okay, in that case, take that as agreed. And that's the final item on today's agenda. So thank you very much, everyone, for your attendance, particularly our guests today. And see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.